We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Gimel Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 93b. This daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amid or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amid, we were dealing with the Machlokas Amoraim between Rav and Shmuel, whether we follow majority by monetary cases or not. Rav says that we do follow majority, and Shmuel says we do not follow majority. And the Gemara is now in the middle of saying that this is actually a Machlokas Tanoim, as we see from this Brisa. The Brisa here is discussing a case where a person buys seeds and then it turns out that they don't grow properly. So the Tanakam of the Brisa says, even if you're talking about a situation where the majority of the seeds that were being purchased are generally used for planting, still the buyer has no claim. We do not follow majority. Rather, we say that the sale goes through in this case, and therefore that part of the Brisa, that Tanakama, seems to be against Rav. We seem to be not following majority. And the Brisa here continues with Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Rabbi Yossi says, no sein lo, demei zera, no, he does have to give him the value of the seeds, meaning to say, you do follow majority, as the Rashbam says, no sein lo demei zera, sharov pishtan shaba olam nizra. Most of the time when you buy flax seeds, the idea is to plant it. Therefore, the buyer does have a legitimate claim, and we do in fact follow rov, and therefore this part of the Brisa, Rabbi Yossi, seems to be following the opinion of Rav. And then the Brisa continues, Amru lo, they said back to him, they said back to Rabbi Yossi, Harbe lochin oso ledvar macherim. It's not true. There are many people who buy flax seeds for other purposes, and so therefore you're claiming that the majority of flax seeds are used for planting, but there are many purchases of flax seeds that are actually, and even maybe a majority of purchases of flax seeds that are not for planting. The idea over here seems to be, the dispute between the Amru lo and Rabbi Yossi seems to be, even though the majority of flax seeds are certainly planted, but you have a lot of purchases that are made with a small amount of seeds. So if you would look at the number of purchases, it could actually turn out that the majority of purchases are not for the purpose of planting. So are we looking at the number of seeds, or are we looking at the number of purchases? That seems to be the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Amru lo at the end of the Brisa. And the Gemara here clarifies. The Gemara says, Man tanoi. So who do you mean to say when you're saying this issue of whether we follow majorities of machlokas tanoim? Which tanoim are we looking at in this Brisa? Because there seems to be three tanoim in this Brisa. There's a Tanakama, there's Rabbi Yossi, and then there's the end, the Amru lo. They said to him. And that's what the Gemara now says. Ilema Rabbi Yossi va'amru lo. If you're going to say there's a machlokas tanoim between Rabbi Yossi and the Amru lo, that's not true. Tarvayu Basra Ruba Azli. They're both following majority. It's just a question which majority. Mar Azel Basra Ruba Din. One follows the majority of people. Umar Azel Basra Ruba Dizriya. The other one follows the majority of the planting. And so therefore it's just a question of, do we follow the purchases that are made? Do we follow the number of seeds? But everyone's following majority. And so the Gemara says, you're right. Either you'll say it's machlokas tanoim between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi, because again the Tanakama is certainly not following majority, Rabbi Yossi is, or Tanakama v'Amru lo, or it could be a machlokas tanoim between the Tanakama and the Amru lo. Again, the Tanakama is certainly not following majority, and the Amru lo, like Rabbi Yossi, is following majority. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Mahu no sein lo, what exactly does the seller give to the buyer? This means to say, in a situation where the seller does have to reimburse the buyer because the seeds were planted and they did not grow, so how much does the seller actually have to pay? And the first opinion is, demei zera, you have to pay the value of the seeds, v'lo hotza, but not the expenses, meaning the buyer, he had to hire laborers to actually plant all of these seeds. That the seller, that amount of money, the seller does not owe the buyer. V'yeshom, there are others who say, no, the seller has to pay the buyer even for the expenses, even for the laborers that the buyer hired, he has to pay that as well. And the Gemara says, Man yesh omrim, who is this yesh omrim, who say that you have to pay, the seller has to reimburse even for the hotzah, even for what was spent? Amr Rav Chisda says, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, we're going to say it's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, and the Gemara says, hey Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, which Rav Shimon ben Gamliel are we referring to? Which Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that the seller has to reimburse the buyer even for the hotzah, even for the expenses? The Gemara says, Ileim Rav Shimon ben Gamliel de Masnisen. If you're going to say it's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel of our Mishnah, and our Mishnah, at the end of the Mishnah brings the sheet of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, and the Gemara now brings the Mishnah. The Tanan, as we learned in our Mishnah, Hamocher peiros lechaveiro. Let's say a person sells produce to his friend, v'zaran v'lo tzamchu, and he plants the seeds and they don't grow. V'afilu zarapishtan, even when we're talking about flax seeds, which the majority of them are planted, eino chayav b'achra yusan. So we say the seller, he's not obligated, he's not chayav to take any responsibility. and we'll read the parentheses, we make an inference from the Tanakama over here. Hazirune gina she'enon ne'cholim. Let's say you're talking about garden seeds, which are not edible at all. It seems like the Tanakama would say chay bachar yusan. So there, it's 100% that they're being used to plant. So there already the seller would be responsible. We can infer that the Tanakama would hold that. But the Gemara continues, Ema Seifa. Now let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Zirune gina, if you're talking about garden seeds, she'ena ne'cholim, which are not edible, chay bachar yusan, so then the seller is in fact responsible. That seems exactly the same as the inference we made from the Tanakama. So the Gemara says, Tanakama nami hachikamar. Isn't the Tanakama saying the same thing? How is Rav Shimon ben Gamliel arguing with the Tanakama? It seems that the Tanakama would agree, because the Tanakama was saying, Zera pishtan hu de'eno chay bachar yusan, when we're talking about flax seeds, which is a majority issue, so there the seller is not responsible. Hazirune gina, but when we're talking about garden seeds, she'ena ne'cholim, which 100% are not edible, so chay bachar yusan, the Tanakama would also agree that the seller is responsible. How is Rav Shimon ben Gamliel different than the Tanakama? And so the Gemara says, Elalav, rather is it not? Hotzah ika benayu, this is exactly the machlokas, whether the seller is responsible even for the buyer's expenses. Mar savar demei zera, the Tanakama holds he's only responsible for the value of the seeds themselves. Umar savar, and Rav Shimon ben Gamliel holds af hotzah, that's what Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is coming to add, even the hotzah, even the expenses, the seller is responsible for. Now the Gemara first says, Mimai, well, how do you even know that's the case? Even if they're arguing about hotzah, you don't know who says what. Dilma ibcha, maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is the one who says that the seller is not responsible for the expenses. To that the Gemara says, Halo kasha, that's not difficult. Because kol Tana Basra, the general rule is that the later Tana, l'tefuye milsa ka'asi, is always coming to add on, and so therefore the later Tana in the Mishnah over here is Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, and he would be coming to add on that the seller is responsible even for expenses. But the Gemara still says, V'dil makula Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, it's not true, because maybe there is no machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah, so you don't have to say Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is adding anything. Maybe the entire Mishnah is actually Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. V'chesurei mechser v'hachikatani, and maybe there are words missing, and you should read it as follows: Hamocher peros l'chavero v'zaran v'lo tzimechu. If a person sells produce to his friend and he plants them and they don't grow, afilu zerapishan, even if it's flax seeds, eino chay bachar yusan, he's not responsible. Divrei Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, that's the opinion of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. This is all Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel omer, because Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says zerone gina, only by garden seeds, she'ena ne'cholim, which are not edible at all, chay bachar yusan. Only over there you're chayiv, the seller is going to be responsible, and so therefore you don't have to say that that's what Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is saying in our Mishnah. And so still we're looking for where does Rav Shimon ben Gamliel say that the seller is even responsible for the expenses. And so the Gemara continues, Ella, rather, hard Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, it's the following Rav Shimon ben Gamliel that says that the seller is responsible even for expenses. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, this is from the Tosefta, Hamolich chitin litzchon, if a person brings over wheat and he's giving it over to someone to grind, velo lissan, the person doesn't moisten it properly, vasan subin or morsan, and he turns it into bran or coarse bran. Or a similar case, kemach lenachtam, a person gives flour to a baker, vafo pasniful, and he underbakes it, and now it's bread that crumbles. Or behema letabach, let's say a person gives an animal to a butcher, v'nibla to a slaughterer, and then he slaughters it improperly, and it becomes an avela, it becomes not kosher. So chayiv, in all of these cases, the person who he gave it over to, the worker, is going to be responsible. Memneshu kanose sachar, because essentially he's like a shomer sachar, he's like a paid watchman, and he's responsible over here for the fact that he didn't prepare the wheat properly, or he didn't prepare the bread properly, or he didn't slaughter the animal properly. That's what the Tanakama says in this brisa. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, and this is the Rav Shimon ben Gamliel that we're identifying over here, he says not only is this worker responsible to pay, but he has to pay even nosen lo demei boshto. He even has to pay him the value of his embarrassment. Let's say he was going to serve this at some kind of a feast, at some kind of a banquet, and now he didn't have any food for the banquet, so there's a level of boshus there, there's embarrassment over there, and Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that the person is responsible even for that, and that's the same idea over here also. You're going to be responsible not only for the seeds, but also for the expenses that the buyer undertook in order to plant those seeds. You have to pay for his embarrassment to demei boshas orchav, and also the value of the embarrassment of the guests. V'chein hayir Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, and similarly Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Minag gadol haya b'Yerushalayim, there was a great custom in Yerushalayim, hamoser seuda l'chaver, if somebody gave over a meal, gave over the raw foods to his friend to prepare, v'kilkel, and then he ruined the meal. So no sein lo demei boshto demei boshas orchav, you have to give, he has to pay for his embarrassment, and he has to pay the value of the embarrassment of the guests, and that's the Rav Shimon ben Gamliel that we're saying would say you're responsible, the seller is responsible for the expenses as well. And the Gemara continues, Od minhag gadol haya b'Yerushalayim. There was another great minhag, says Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in Yerushalayim, mapa prusa agave haPesach, if they would spread a cloth over the entrance, let's say to the banquet hall, if there was a cloth that was by the entrance, so kol zman shemapa prusa, as long as that cloth was spread, orchen and nichnas, and then the guests would enter, they would know that there's food available. But nistalka hamapa, once the cloth was taken away, was removed, ein ha'orchen nichnas, and it meant that the guests should no longer enter, there was no longer food available for them. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, and this Mishnah is discussing when a buyer is buying something in a large quantity from a seller, there should be an assumption that a certain amount of it is going to be rotten or spoiled, how much is considered acceptable and how much is considered not to be acceptable, and that's what the Mishnah details. The Mishnah says, Hamocher peres lechaver, if somebody sells produce to his friend, this is talking about grain, Hareza mekabel olav rova tinofis l'sa, a person can assume that a quarter kav is going to be bad among a saw of grain. Te'enim, if a person buys figs, Makabel olav eser misulos lameya, person can assume that 10 of them will be infested for every 100. Martif shal yain, a person buys a cellar of wine, Makabel olav eser kosasos lameya, person can assume that 10 barrels are going to be sour out of 100. Kankanim b'sharon, if somebody buys jugs in Sharon, Makabel olav eser pitasos lameya, a person can assume that 10 of the jugs will be bad wine out of every 100. And the Gemara continues, Tani Rav Katina taught, when it says in our Mishnah that a person buys grain, he accepts upon himself 1/4 kav of tinofis, of some kind of impurity for every saw. What kind of impurity exactly are we talking about? So if Katina says, Rova kitnius l'sa, means that if a person is buying a saw of grain, he can assume that there might be 1/4 kav of kitnius of legumes. And so the Gemara says, Va'afruris lo, but let's say there's 1/4 kav of dirt. That would not be acceptable. It only has to be something like legumes. V'yomer Rabba bar Chia katosfa, but Rabba bar Chia katosfa said, Mishmei de Rabba, he said in the name of Rabba, Borer tzuror migarno shal chaver. Let's say a person separates out a pebble, separates pebbles out from the granary of his friend, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Dalid Amud Aleph.